Tim Scott has announced, and he did it on Trey Gowdy's show on Fox over the weekend. Now, I should tell you, my buddy Joe writes at Red State, and he sent me a funny note. He noted that Tim Scott announced on TV he was dropping out, and someone from Fox emailed and said, hey, please credit Trey Gowdy's show. That's where they did it. Yes, absolutely.
I'm trying to process this information, and I'm trying to do it on live television. So forgive me. You are the highest ranking African American Republican politician in the country. You were asked to give the response to the State of the Union, and I did not hear a single negative word about your response. I mean, that's usually a death sentence for people. You gave a great response to the State of the Union. You gave a nominating speech in 2020. You have introduced opportunity zones, and you have worked on criminal justice reform. Maybe I shouldn't ask you. Maybe I should ask the voters what it says about the Republican Party that someone with that resume is suspending his presidential campaign.
Trey Gowdy and Tim Scott, obviously Trey Gowdy from South Carolina friends, caught him off guard, caught Tim Scott's staff off guard. Here's what I know. Tim Scott is not going anywhere in the presidential race, which was obvious, but his staff did not expect him to announce the suspension of his campaign on TV last night. They were as surprised as Trey Gowdy. Now, they obviously had to suspect something was coming because Tim Scott, for a time, got some traction in Iowa. I know some of his opponents, particularly DeSantis' team, they belittle anyone who is starting to get traction, including now Nikki Haley. Tim Scott got some traction in Iowa. No, it's not real. Don't believe it. He did, for a time, get some traction in Iowa, but it faded when the DeSantis team started airing ads and the Scott campaign could not keep up the airing of ads. And Scott faded back to 6%. Scott and Vivek Ramaswamy have been battling it out around the 4 to 6% mark in Iowa. Now, where does Tim Scott's vote go? I suspect most of it will help Nikki Haley. They're both from South Carolina. They're both running contrary to the Trump populist streak that is DeSantis' lane. So I suspect he's going to help Nikki Haley, who's about to drop $10 million in Iowa on an ad campaign. Now, the DeSantis people are all unified in their position that Nikki Haley daring to improve herself only helps Donald Trump, and they're entitled to that, and mathematically they may be right, but Nikki Haley is entitled as a candidate to try. Let her try. Who knows? She's running in her own lane. I tend to be sympathetic to the DeSantis argument that if Nikki Haley drops out tomorrow, her voters don't go to Trump, but if DeSantis drops out tomorrow, his voters do. Therefore, he's the preferred alternative to Trump. That makes sense to me. But, Nikki Haley, I've known her for years. She's a good friend of mine, and she has always made her own lane in politics. And that is what people, particularly the DeSantis critics, miss about Haley, is that she does not find a lane. Nikki Haley brings out the paving equipment and makes her own lane. She always has. She has always made her own lane. She's never been pigeonholed into, well, you're going to be the foreign policy lane, or you're going to be the libertarian-leaning Southern governor lane, or whatever. She makes her own lane. She always has. That's how she's won. She's entitled to try again. It might not work. It might. I'm not very sympathetic to all the belly aching in that regard from the DeSantis people who are just convinced he must be the one, and yet he's not gaining a lot more traction right now. He's kind of been stagnant. Tim Scott's departure will help DeSantis some, but I suspect most of it goes to the Haley people, in large part because Haley and Scott have both avoided the strong populist lane that DeSantis is running in. But what of Tim Scott himself? Tim Scott came to my gathering in August. He was actually the first person on stage that Friday. Had a great conversation with Tim Scott. He's a friend, like him a ton. He's just an all-around good guy. But that was part of the problem, too, is that when he got off stage, everybody loved the guy. They really, really like him. They applauded, they cheered. He had great lines. His mom was there. His aunt was there. They were warmly received by the crowd, and he left. And the word that kept coming up was precious. People didn't want Tim Scott to be roughed up because they liked him too much. They didn't want him to have to be the nasty, angry guy they expect in politics. To some degree, it's a damning indictment on the individual voters of both parties that they think they've got to have someone who's going to throw punches and be a bull in a china shop and be a nasty guy. They think that's what it takes to win, and they don't want to try someone else who isn't like that, who stands out in a different way. That's on the voters. At the same time, let's be honest here. You're going to have a nasty campaign, and you can't all shucks your way out of the attacks the Democrats are going to throw at you. There are a lot of people who just love Tim Scott. They like him so much they don't want to see him go through the hell that he would have to go through if he were the nominee, and that hurt him. There will be a lot of people who say, well, this is all on the voters. The voters are just good people can't run for office anymore. Only terrible people can run. That's not really true. But the good people, the nice people, the kind people who do run do have to be able to, like Christ in the temple, overturn the money changers' tables. You got to be able to throw a punch. And people didn't think Tim Scott could, would, or they didn't want him to get punched. If anything, Tim Scott's failure to launch his campaign is actually a testament to him, his character, and his likability. People are like, oh, I don't want to see this guy get roughed up, and I don't want to see him like lose his soul to it, so I'm not going to vote for him. It actually is commendable to Tim Scott. He's dropping out like this. Now, there's something else to be said here. Tim Scott, who had a pulse, his campaign was going nowhere, but he raised some money. He got on the debate stage. He still polled in the mid-single digits, 6-7%. Compare Tim Scott leaving to Asa Hutchinson and Doug Burgum, who refused to leave. Doug Burgum has issued a statement and said he's staying in through New Hampshire. It's kind of a damning indictment on the character of Asa Hutchinson and Doug Burgum that they, at 0%, would think that they should stay in when Tim Scott, who is at 6 or 7% and had greater name ID and visibility, decides, you know what, it's not worth it, I'm going to stay. Now, to a degree, Burgum and Hutchinson, they're not costing anyone anything. The race is not consolidating because of their entry. They're just kind of there. Their names on the ballot and nothing more. But it is remarkable to me that a Will Hurd, who went nowhere, like Burgum and Hutchinson, could have enough sense to say, I'm not cutting it, I'm getting out. A Mike Pence, who was polling better than Tim Scott in Iowa, could say, time for me to get out. Tim Scott could say, time for me to get out. And Asa Hutchinson and Doug Burgum say, we're staying in, now's our time. You know what it reminds me of when I say it that way? Don't shoot me, Philip. For years and years that Philip has worked for me, he's a huge Tennessee fan. And Tennessee, with the exception of this weekend, didn't have a good weekend, but the University of Tennessee has definitely rebounded in its football program. It's had some great games lately. But for years, every year, no matter how bad they were, when football season started, my friend in orange would say, this is our year, this is our year. It was never their year. Still not, but getting closer. It's like Doug Burgum and Asa Hutchinson. It's like, this is our year. Tim Scott's gone. Mike Pence is gone. Will Hurd's gone. We're going to rally now. We're going to surge. No, you're not. Get out. But no one can make them get out. And then there's Christie, who I know and like, who is in Israel. Wanted to go see it for himself. It's not going to help Christie. Having eyewitnesses does matter. And Christie is right on this, by the way. Christie is in Israel, and he said he believes it's important to see it for myself and relate to the voters what I've seen. And he's right. And I found this with a number of people. There were a lot of people who last week wanted me to go see the video footage, the raw, unedited footage of the Hamas horrors. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I've already seen parts of it, and I still can't get it out of my head. I don't want to put any more of it in my head. But there were a lot of people who were like, listen, if you go see that it's real, I'll believe it. And that was Christie's point. It was worth going to Israel to see on the ground for himself what's going on, to report back. I don't think it's going to help him because Republican voters are almost uniformly on the side of Israel. But it does give him some credibility in being able to narrate what's going on. But I don't think it helps his poll numbers. So I continue to be perplexed at Christie staying in the race. But between Christie, Hutchinson, and Burgum, Christie is actually like in third or fourth place in New Hampshire. Christie has support in New Hampshire that these other guys don't have. It's just remarkable to me that the guys with the lowest name ID and the least support are the ones who are like, well, doggone it, we're going to stay in the race until after New Hampshire. I see no point. If you want to spend the money, spend the money. But at this point, they're not going to be on debate stages. They're not going to affect the race. The race is consolidated down to Nikki Haley versus Ron DeSantis. But there's a problem. It's Nikki Haley versus Ron DeSantis for second place. None of them still has a strategy for beating Donald Trump. They're still beating each other while Donald Trump is in first place with between 40 and 60%, depending on the state. They're relying now on external affairs and external events to end Donald Trump, whether it's conviction or act of God, lightning bolt or something, to end Donald Trump's run for the presidency. Maybe they can find a way forward. And I will tell you this, and this God's honest truth. I don't think the Trump team would be continuing to pour as many resources into Iowa as they are against DeSantis and be using Ramaswamy as a proxy to go after Haley if they themselves weren't seeing something that suggests some vulnerability there. The DeSantis theory has always been if you make Trump bleed in Iowa, people see, oh, he's not inevitable, and that changes things everywhere else. And I think there's some legitimacy to that, and I think the Trump team thinks there's some legitimacy to that as well, or they wouldn't still be spending more money attacking DeSantis than promoting Trump or attacking Biden. And all of this shakes up a little bit more with Scott out of the running, and I suspect we're about to see more attacks on Nikki Haley because I do suspect that Tim Scott, though he says he's not going to endorse, that he and Pence, their support trends towards Haley. It's not a surprise to me that Haley has trended up further after Pence got out of the race. I think we'll see the same now with Scott getting out of the race. And if DeSantis can't figure out how to recapture some momentum in Iowa, we may be talking about a new second place person in Iowa. They've got to figure out a way to do it. And I suspect the way they'll do it is try to blow up Haley with negative ads, which is why she's going up with 10 million, and Scott out of the race. Well, it allows some real consolidation to finally happen.
You're listening to the